Victor Hale signed the marriage certificate with a smile. Not the smile of a man doing something kind. The smile of a man who had just poisoned a well and was watching someone walk toward it thirsty. He leaned back in his leather chair, tapped the forged document against his palm, and said to the man standing across the desk, "Find me the biggest woman in Philadelphia, the kind that makes men stare at their boots. Send her west on the next train." His associate blinked. "Sir?" Rowan Mercer thinks he can survive another winter. Victor set the paper down and smoothed it with one finger. Let's give him something extra to carry. If you've ever been used as someone else's weapon without knowing it, if you've ever walked into a room where people were already laughing at you before you opened your mouth, then you already know how this story begins. Because Adeline Pierce was about to step off a train into the worst joke anyone had ever played on another human being, and she had no idea. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where the underdog doesn't just survive, they win, subscribe right now and stay until the end. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And hit that like button, because what happens next in this woman's life is something you won't see coming. The train was late by 4 hours, which Adeline Pierce spent sitting perfectly still in the last car, hands folded in her lap, watching the Dakota Territory swallow the horizon. She was not a woman given to panic. She had made her decision back in Philadelphia with a clear head and both eyes open, or so she believed. The letter had been direct, even courteous. A rancher named Rowan Mercer, 38 years old, owner of Whisper Creek Ranch, a working cattle operation outside the town of Granton, Dakota Territory, seeking a wife for the winter season and beyond. Practical arrangement. Honest home. She had read it 6 times before she answered it. She was 31. Her mother was 2 years dead. Her father's printing shop had burned in August, and what the fire didn't take, his creditors did. She had 3 good dresses, a trunk of books, a gift for numbers that no employer in Philadelphia seemed to want from a woman, and no illusions about romantic love saving her from anything. She answered the letter because it was honest, or it had seemed honest. The train lurched to a stop. Adeline stood, smoothed the front of her wool traveling dress, dark green, practical, the kind of dress designed to hide what it covered rather than flatter it, and lifted her carpet bag from the rack above her seat. She was a large woman. She had known it her entire life, had worn that knowledge the way some women wore a scar, quietly and without apology. Her arms were strong, her feet were steady. She stepped off the train onto the platform at Granton without needing anyone's hand. What she did not expect was the crowd. There were perhaps 20 people on the platform, not the kind of crowd that gathers to welcome someone, the kind that gathers to watch. She saw it in the first second, the way bodies angled toward her with a particular tension, the way a murmur moved through them like wind through dry grass. A man near the station door said something she didn't catch, and the 2 beside him laughed. Adeline squared her shoulders and walked toward the station house. "That's her?" A woman's voice, not bothering to lower itself. "Lord in heaven. Mercer's going to drop dead when he sees her. He might be better off." She kept walking. She had learned a long time ago that the best response to a crowd like this was forward motion. Stop moving and you gave them a target. Keep moving and you became something harder to hit. A woman with somewhere to be. Inside the station house, a young clerk behind the counter looked up, looked down, and then looked up again with the particular expression of someone fighting between pity and amusement and losing to both. "You'd be the Pierce woman?" "Adeline Pierce." "Yes." Rowan Mercer sent word he'd be along after he finished loading feed. The clerk slid a paper across the counter, said to wait. She waited. She sat on the bench along the far wall, set her carpet bag at her feet, and opened the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. Numbers steadied her, even made-up ones. She wrote out the estimated cost of a train ticket from Philadelphia. She knew that exactly, and began calculating what a comparable journey might cost going north if she needed to go north, if whatever waited at Whisper Creek Ranch turned out to be something she could not accommodate. She was on her 3rd column when the station door opened and the cold came in ahead of the man. Rowan Mercer was not what the letter had suggested and not what she'd imagined. The letter had implied a settled man, someone organized enough to put words to paper and practical enough to mean them. She had imagined someone middle-aged and tired, maybe a little thick around the middle, the kind of man worn down by solitude until he decided he needed someone to manage the house. What walked through the door was something else. He was tall in the way that men get when they spend years doing outdoor work. Not built for appearance, but built by use, shoulders wide from actual labor, not show. His face was weathered past what 38 should look like, with two deep lines bracketing his mouth and a jawline that probably hadn't been introduced to a razor this week. He wore a canvas coat with a tear along the left sleeve that had been sewn back together badly. His boots were caked with something she decided not to examine. He scanned the station. His eyes landed on her. She watched him work through it. The same calculation she had seen on 20 faces on the platform. That rapid, ruthless inventory that people perform when they see something they weren't expecting. She watched it happen, and she held very still, the way she had learned to hold still, and she waited for whatever came next. What came next surprised her. He crossed the room, stopped in front of her, and extended one hand. "Miss Pierce." She shook it. His grip was firm and impersonal, the grip of a man who shakes hands with other men all day and isn't thinking about it. "Mr. Mercer." "You have more luggage?" "One trunk. They said it's in the freight room." He nodded, turned, went to get it. No comment about her appearance, no visible reaction to the gap between whatever he'd expected and what had arrived. She watched him go and told herself not to read anything into that yet. Silence could mean a lot of things. She found out what it meant when they stepped outside together, and the cluster of men near the livery saw them walking side by side. The laughter started before they were 10 feet down the boardwalk. Not subtle laughter, not the kind people try to contain. The full, open, shoulder-shaking kind that men allow themselves when they think the target can't do anything about it. "Rowan," one of them called out. "Victor Hale sends his compliments." More laughter. Rowan stopped walking. Adeline stopped beside him. She heard the name, Victor Hale, and filed it away without knowing yet what it meant. Rowan turned his head toward the men at the livery with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who has made the decision not to run from things. He looked at them for a long moment. Not with anger exactly. More like a man reading a sign to make sure he understood what it said. Then he turned back and kept walking. "This way," he said to Adeline, and his voice had not changed at all. She kept pace with him. The laughter followed them down the street and didn't stop until they turned the corner toward the wagon. The drive to Whisper Creek took nearly 2 hours. The snow started an hour in. Not blizzard conditions, not yet, but the kind of steady gray falling that announces something larger is behind it. Rowan drove without speaking. Adeline sat beside him on the wagon bench with her carpet bag on her lap and watched the land go flat in every direction. She had grown up in Philadelphia. She knew noise, brick walls, the smell of coal smoke and horse manure, and bread from bakeries that opened before dawn. She did not know this vast, indifferent silence broken only by wind and the sound of the horses and the creak of the wagon wheels against frozen ground. It should have frightened her. Instead, she felt something she didn't expect, something that took her a moment to name. Space. After 10 minutes, she said, "The man they mentioned, Victor Hale. Who is he?" Rowan was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Biggest cattle operation in the territory, about 6,000 acres between him and his partner. And you?" 400. "Is there a history between you?" Another pause. "He wants my water rights. Creek runs through my south pasture. If he gets it, he can run twice the cattle he runs now." Adeline thought about that. "And he arranged this?" She gestured between them, encompassing the whole situation. The letter, the train, the crowd at the station, the laughter. Rowan's jaw moved. "That's what I figure." "He forged your letter of correspondence." "I didn't write any letter." She absorbed that. The implications arranged themselves in her mind with uncomfortable clarity. She had not responded to a lonely rancher seeking a practical arrangement. She had been used. A package sent without her knowledge to serve as someone else's mockery. She should have been devastated. She had expected to feel the bottom drop out of something. Instead, she felt a different thing, something colder and more useful than devastation. She felt the particular anger of a woman who has spent her entire life being dismissed by people who thought they were smarter than her, and who has been proven right about them every single time. "I see," she said. Rowan glanced at her sideways. He seemed to be looking for tears, or a demand to be taken back to the station, or some version of the scene he'd been bracing for the entire drive. He didn't find any of those things. "I'm sorry," he said finally. It came out rough, like a word he didn't use often. You came all this way. I came all this way, she agreed. And I'm here now. He looked at her again. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but the first small erosion of the wall he'd put up before he ever got to the station. They didn't speak again until they reached the ranch. Whisper Creek was not what the letter had described, because the letter had been fiction. But the ranch itself told a true story, and Adeline read it the moment she stepped down from the wagon. The fencing needed repair along the south side. The barn doors were hanging wrong. One hinge had been replaced, one hadn't, which meant they'd been fighting those doors open and closed all autumn. The main house was solid enough, log construction, good foundation, but the roof had a patch near the chimney that looked recent and not quite right. This was a ranch run by a man alone. And a man alone, no matter how capable, eventually started losing ground on the small things because there weren't enough hours and not enough hands. She picked up her carpet bag and followed him inside. The main room was what she had expected. Functional, spare, cold, in the way that rooms get when no one has been tending a fire. A stone hearth. A plank table with two mismatched chairs. A shelf with a few cans, a tin coffee pot, a lantern. Not dirty exactly, but empty in some way that went beyond furniture. Rowan had set her trunk by the door. He stood in the middle of the room with his hands on his hips, looking at the dead hearth like he was waiting for it to do something. There's a room in the back, he said. Not large. It's yours. Thank you. I'll get a fire going. She set her bag down on the table, unbuttoned her coat, and hung it on the peg by the door. She looked around the kitchen, what there was of it. A cast iron stove, cold. A small collection of pots and pans, dusty from disuse. A few sacks of grain and dried beans in the corner. Half a cured ham hanging from a hook. When did you last eat a full meal? She asked. He was crouched at the hearth, building kindling into a stack. He looked up. This morning. What was it? He hesitated. Hardtack and coffee. She looked at the ham, she looked at the sacks of beans, she looked at the cold stove and the dusty pots, and the man crouched at the hearth who had driven 2 hours through the start of a snowstorm to retrieve a woman he hadn't sent for, and who had every reason to be furious with her existence. She rolled up her sleeves. Get that fire going, she said, and bring me water from wherever you keep it. He looked at her for a moment, not suspicious exactly, more like a man who has learned to wait for the catch before he agrees to anything. Then he turned back to the hearth. She found the water barrel around the back of the stove. She found a pot that was decent enough once she wiped it out. She opened the sack of beans, and the first thing she noticed was they were good quality. Someone had bought right, even if they'd been eating wrong. She started sorting them by feel, pulling out the broken ones, and her hands moved the way her hands always moved when she cooked. Quickly, without wasted motion, with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been feeding people since she was 12 years old. The fire caught. The room began to change. It happened slowly, the way warmth always works. Not a sudden transformation, but an accumulation. The smell of wood smoke, then the knock of the pot against the stove, then the smell of something real beginning to happen in that kitchen. Adeline found dried onion in a paper bag at the back of the shelf, found salt, found a small piece of salted pork tucked behind the grain sack that she suspected Rowan had forgotten about. She started talking while she worked. Not to fill silence, she wasn't afraid of silence, but because she needed certain information and asking for it directly, while her hands were busy and his defenses were down, seemed like the most efficient approach. How many head of cattle? Rowan had settled into the chair by the hearth. He still had his coat on. 63. Down from 80 in August. What happened to the others? A pause. Summer was dry. Lost a few to the heat. Lost some more to a fence cut on the east side in September. She turned that over. A fence cut. You mean someone cut it? I mean someone cut it. Hail? Can't prove it. She nodded, kept stirring. Do you have a ledger? Financial records for the ranch? Somewhere. I'll need to see it. Silence. She felt him looking at her back. Why? Because you're bleeding money somewhere and you may not know where. She didn't say it harshly. She said it the way she would have said the beans need more time, as a plain fact. I'm good with numbers. It's the one thing I'm genuinely good at. If you have records, I can find what's wrong. She heard the chair creak. She heard him stand up. Who told you something was wrong? The roof patch, the mixed fencing hardware, the fact that you bought good beans and ate hardtack this morning. She turned to look at him. A man doesn't make those choices when his finances are healthy. He makes them when he's rationing. He stared at her. She turned back to the stove. The beans came together with the pork and the onion into something that was not elegant, but was hot and real and filling. The kind of food that reminds a person's body that it is alive and that alive is worth something. She found two bowls that didn't match, which seemed appropriate, and set them on the table with the coffee pot. Rowan sat across from her. He picked up the spoon. He ate one bite. He didn't say anything for a while after that. He just ate, slowly, with the careful attention of a man who has been eating bad food for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like when food tasted like something. Halfway through the bowl, he set down his spoon. "I didn't send that letter," he said. "I want you to be clear on that." "I am clear on that." "You don't have to stay." She looked at him across the table. Outside, the snow had picked up. She could hear it now against the window. That whispering, insistent sound of a serious storm beginning to commit to itself. She thought about the platform at the station, the laughter. The name Victor Hale said with satisfaction. She thought about a man who had signed a forged document and smiled about it. "Where would I go?" she asked. And it was not a question about geography. It was a question about something else. About what staying meant and what leaving meant, and who in the end was going to win. Rowan picked up his spoon again. "Ledger's in the desk in the back room," he said. "I'll get it after supper." The fire had warmed the whole room by then. She hadn't noticed when it happened, the moment the cold broke and the air became something livable. That's how it works. Not a dramatic change, just a slow accumulation of small things adding up to something different than what was there before. She refilled his bowl without being asked. He didn't thank her. He just ate. And somewhere in Victor Hale's comfortable office on the far side of Granton, behind his polished desk and his signed documents and his careful scheme, he was sitting in his own warm room, completely convinced that the winter would destroy Rowan Mercer. He had no idea that the person he'd sent to do it was currently teaching herself the layout of the kitchen, memorizing which pot was the good one, and planning to open a ledger that would eventually expose everything Victor Hale had spent 3 years hiding. He had underestimated her so completely that he hadn't even thought of her as a person. That was his first mistake, and it would not be his last. The ledger was worse than she expected. Adeline had seen bad bookkeeping before. Her father's printing shop, in its final years, had been a masterclass in wishful thinking translated into numbers. Income recorded optimistically, expenses forgotten conveniently. The gap between the two columns bridged by a kind of financial faith that had no business calling itself accounting. She had cleaned up those books for 3 years before the fire made the whole exercise irrelevant. But Rowan's ledger wasn't bad bookkeeping. It was something more troubling than that. She sat at the small desk in the back room with the lantern pulled close, turning pages slowly, running her finger down column after column. Rowan had come in once, around 9 o'clock, and stood in the doorway with a second cup of coffee. He didn't offer and then apparently thought better of the whole visit, turning and going back to the main room without a word. She heard him banking the fire for the night. She heard the specific creak of the floorboard near the window that she'd already learned meant he was looking outside, checking the snow. She kept reading. The entries were in 3 different handwriting styles, which was the first problem. Rowan's own hand was cramped and left-leaning, the writing of a man who taught himself from limited materials and never got fully comfortable with a pen. But there were stretches of entries in a second hand, neater, more deliberate. And then, beginning in the spring of 1881, a third hand she didn't recognize at all, thin-stroked and precise, the handwriting of someone trained in a counting house or a bank. She went back to the beginning and started over. By midnight, she had found 4 things that did not belong. By 1 in the morning, she had found 11. By the time the fire in the main room had burned down to coals and the wind outside had committed fully to the kind of violence that announces a genuine Dakota blizzard, she had found something that made her sit very still with both hands flat on the desk. There was a loan. It was recorded in that third precise handwriting, dated March of 1882, for $340. The lender listed was Granton Territorial Bank. The collateral listed was the South Pasture. 40 acres that she now understood included the creek, the water rights, the thing Victor Hale wanted badly enough to forge a marriage document and ship a stranger across 3 states. The loan itself might have been legitimate. Ranchers borrowed against land. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual, what made her press both hands flat against the desk and breathe carefully for a moment, was what came after it. There were 12 payment entries below the loan record, all in that same third handwriting, all showing payments made and received, balance reducing steadily. The final entry, dated September of 1883, 2 months ago, showed the loan fully paid. Balance zero. Account closed. She pulled out the page she'd found tucked inside the back cover of the ledger, the page that had been folded twice and pressed flat, the page she'd almost missed entirely. It was a letter from Granton Territorial Bank, dated October 1883, addressed to Rowan Mercer, informing him that his account was in arrears, that $340 remained outstanding against the collateral of the south pasture, that if payment was not received by the 1st of April, 1884, the bank would exercise its right to claim the collateral in settlement of the debt. 12 payment entries in the ledger. 12 payments. Rowan apparently believed he had made a letter from the bank saying not one of them had arrived. She sat with that for a long time. The money had gone somewhere. It had left Rowan's hands. She could see the entries, could see the dates aligned with what looked like regular quarterly trips to town, and it had never reached the bank, which meant someone between Rowan and the bank had been intercepting it, or the bank itself was lying about receiving it, or both. She folded the letter carefully and set it on top of the ledger. In the main room, she heard Rowan shift in his chair. He hadn't gone to bed. She wasn't sure he did most nights. She picked up the lantern and went to find him. He was in the chair by the dead fire with his boots still on, and his head tipped back and his eyes open, staring at the ceiling with the focused blankness of a man thinking through something he didn't have enough information to think through. He heard her coming and straightened up. "You should sleep," he said. "You should look at this." She set the ledger and the letter on the table between them and turned the lantern up. He looked at the letter first. She watched his face while he read it. It didn't do what she expected. It didn't go red with anger or pale with shock. It went very still instead. That particular stillness she was beginning to recognize as his version of a strong reaction. Everything locked down tight while the internal machinery worked through it. "I made those payments," he said. "I know. They're in the ledger." "Then why?" "Because someone changed the record at the bank." She sat in the second chair and turned the ledger toward him, pointing to the third handwriting. "Do you recognize this?" He leaned over to look. A muscle moved in his jaw. "That's the writing of Dale Hutchins. He's the clerk at the bank. Has been for 4 years." "Was he ever here? At the ranch?" Rowan didn't answer right away. He was turning pages, going back further, finding other entries in that same thin-stroked hand. "He came out twice. Spring of '81 and again in '82. Said he was doing property assessments for the bank. Routine stuff." He stopped on a page. "He had the ledger both times. Said he needed to cross-reference the property records." Adeline nodded slowly. "He was altering it. Why would a bank clerk—" He stopped himself. She saw him get there on his own, saw the exact moment he made the connection. "Hale. Hale uses that bank. Likely has relationships there. A clerk on a territorial bank salary, approached by the biggest landowner in the territory." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Rowan pushed back from the table and stood up. He went to the window. Outside, the storm was full now. She could hear it pressing against the walls, that specific sound of serious Dakota winter asserting itself, the kind of cold that has opinions. "If he gets the south pasture," Rowan said to the glass, "he controls the creek. And if he controls the creek, he controls this whole section. My herd can't survive without that water source in summer." He turned from the window. "I lose the pasture, I lose the ranch inside of 2 years." She had known that already from the ledger, but hearing him say it out loud made it more concrete, more urgent. "You have until April 1st, she said. "That's roughly 4 months." "I don't have $340. "Not right now." She turned back to the ledger. "But I haven't finished going through this. There may be other discrepancies working in your favor, payments they've taken credit for that you don't owe, fees that were invented. Ledger fraud runs both ways. If Hutchins was altering your records, he may have added charges that don't exist." "You can find that?" She looked up at him. "Give me 3 days?" He stood there in the dark room, the fire dead behind him, the storm outside making the walls creak, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face yet, Not warmth, not trust exactly, but something adjacent to trust. The look of a man who has been fighting alone for long enough that the offer of a second pair of hands feels like something almost too good to believe, and he's trying to figure out whether to believe it anyway. 3 days, he said. She closed the ledger. Go to sleep, Mr. Mercer. You look like you haven't properly slept in a month. Rowan, he said. She looked up. If you're going through my books, he said, you can call me Rowan. She nodded once. Adeline. He went to bed. She went back to the desk. The blizzard that arrived that night was the kind that remakes geography. 3 days of snow and wind that erased the fencing lines, buried the water barrel, drifted against the barn door until it took both of them pushing together to get it open in the morning. On the first day, Rowan went out every 4 hours to check on the cattle. On the second day, every 3. On the third day, when visibility was down to arm's length and the temperature dropped past anything, the thermometer on the barn wall was built to measure. He went out every 2 hours, and she started going with him. She hadn't offered. She'd simply been putting on her coat when he reached for his, and he'd looked at her once, assessed whatever he saw, and said nothing. She was not built for grace in deep snow. Nobody was, but she was particularly aware of her own ungainliness, the way she had to lift her legs higher than was dignified, the way the drift seemed to find her specifically. She fell once, going around the corner of the barn, and went down hard on one knee. Rowan reached down a hand. She took it, got up, didn't let go until she was steady, and then let go. Thank you, she said, minding her business, and kept walking. He fell too, on day 3, on the icy patch near the water trough, going down sideways and catching himself on his elbow. She didn't reach for him. She waited while he got up, the way he had waited for her to get up, and they continued without comment. Small things. She was learning that this was how he communicated, not in speeches or gestures, but in small, practical things. He fixed the hinge on the back room door without mentioning it. He left the coffee pot on the warm side of the stove so it was ready when she came in from the cold. One morning, she came into the kitchen to find he'd already brought in water and stoked the cooking stove, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at that, before she went to work. In the evenings, she worked the ledger. He sat by the fire and mended harness or sharpened tools, or occasionally just sat, and sometimes he talked and sometimes he didn't. She learned things in fragments. He had come to this ranch from Minnesota at age 22, following his uncle, who died of influenza the following winter and left him everything, including the debt. He had spent the first 8 years just keeping it alive. He had never married, had come close once, hadn't talked about that part any further, and she didn't push. You were a bookkeeper? He asked one evening, not looking up from the harness he was working on. I kept my father's books from the time I was 16, and I did accounts for 2 other businesses in the neighborhood, a dry goods store and a small manufacturer of ladies' hats. She paused. Neither of them paid me what they would have paid a man, but they both told me I was the best they'd ever worked with when I quit. Why'd you quit? The shop burned. The others didn't need me anymore once they knew I was leaving Philadelphia. She turned a page. People stop valuing what they think they can't keep. He was quiet for a moment, then, that's a bitter way to see it. It's an accurate way to see it. She said it without heat. I'm not bitter about it. I'm just not interested in pretending it wasn't true. He looked up at her then, the first time in the conversation he'd actually looked directly at her. How'd you end up answering a letter like that? From a stranger in Dakota? She kept her eyes on the ledger. The same way anyone makes a decision when all the other doors have closed. You find the one that's still open and you walk through it. A pause. Though it turned out the door was painted on a wall. Adeline. Something in his tone made her look up. He had set down the harness. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, hands loosely together, looking at her with that locked-down expression that she had come to understand meant he was about to say something he'd been working up to for a while. I am sorry, he said. What was done to you, what Hale did, using you as a... I am sorry that happened. She held his gaze. You didn't do it. I know, I'm still sorry it happened to you. She had not expected that. Not the apology itself, he'd apologized before in the wagon, in that rough way. But the specificity of it. The acknowledgement that something had been done to her, not just to the situation, not just to the scheme, but to her. She felt something shift in her chest, something she'd been holding compressed since she stepped off that train, and she made the decision not to let it move, not right now, not in front of him. "Thank you," she said, and looked back at the ledger. On the fourth day, the storm broke. The silence was almost shocking. She had gotten used to the constant pressure of wind and snow against the walls and the roof, had incorporated it into the texture of her days, the way you incorporate traffic noise in a city. And when it stopped, she lay in her bed for several minutes in the early morning, just listening to the quiet, which was so complete it almost had a sound of its own. She had found something the previous night, working late after Rowan had gone to bed, that she hadn't told him about yet. Not because she was hiding it, but because she needed to be absolutely certain before she said the words. She was certain now. In addition to the 12 intercepted loan payments, Dale Hutchins had added 3 separate assessment fees to Rowan's account, each one for $45, each one dated in the spring of years when a banker's clerk would logically come out to do property assessments. The fees were recorded as paid in the bank's ledger, but were not recorded as received in Rowan's ledger, which meant either Rowan had never been informed of them, or he'd refused to pay them and someone had marked them paid anyway, creating phantom debt. $135 of money that existed only on paper but counted against him legally. She also found, cross-referencing 2 pages that Hutchins might not have realized would be compared, a discrepancy in the interest calculation on the original loan. The contracted rate was 6%. The rate actually applied in the running calculations was 8.5%. Over 2 years of compounding, that difference added up to approximately $62. Combined with the phantom fees, that was $197 of invented debt. $340 total claimed by the bank, minus $197 that were fabricated, left $143 of legitimate debt. And Adeline had already identified 4 items in the ledger that the bank had recorded as costs to Rowan, but that showed every sign of being inflated, potentially cutting that further. When Rowan came in from his first morning check on the herd, she was already at the table with the ledger open and her notes arranged beside it. "Sit down," she said. "I need to show you something." He sat. She walked him through it, each discrepancy, each fabricated fee, the interest miscalculation, the intercepted payment trail. She did not soften it or build toward it slowly. She laid it out in order, plain and clear, the way she would have explained a set of accounts to a client who needed to understand what had been done to him. I was very quiet through all of it. When she finished, he sat for a moment looking at the figures she'd written on the separate sheet. "They built a case to take the pasture," he said. "They built a case that looks legally airtight from the outside. Loan, default, collateral claim." She tapped the notes. "From the inside, it's constructed. The payments were intercepted. The fees were invented. The interest was miscalculated upward. None of this would survive examination by an honest court. There isn't an honest judge in Granton." She had expected that. "Is there one in the territorial capital?" He thought about that. "Maybe. One, possibly." "Then that's where these records need to go." She paused. "But we need more than the ledger. The ledger is your record. The bank will say it's wrong. So what do we need? We need either a witness inside the bank, or we need to find where the money went after Hutchins took it." She looked at him steadily. "Someone received 12 quarterly payments of cash. That money exists somewhere. It went to someone." Rowan stared at the table. "Hale. Or Hutchins kept it himself, or they split it." She picked up the coffee cup she'd left sitting there since morning. It was cold. She drank it anyway. "But either way, there's a trail." He stood up, went to the window. The snow outside was blinding white in the morning light, pristine and deceptive, the way the territory often was, beautiful on the surface, indifferent underneath. "If I go to the bank," he said, "Hutchins will know we found it. Yes. And if Hale finds out we know, he'll accelerate. Whatever he's planning next, he'll move it forward." She set the cup down. "Which means we should move first." He turned from the window. There was something different in his face now. Not the locked-down, careful stillness she'd gotten used to, but something more alert, more forward-leaning. He looked like a man who had been backing up for a long time and had just found the wall. "I need to go to town," he said. "Talk to a man named George Pratt. He's a surveyor, does work for a law firm out of the capital. If anyone knows which judge to trust and how to get these records in front of him, go," she said. "I'll copy out everything I found, clean copies, organized so anyone can follow them. By the time you're back, you'll have a document you can hand to a lawyer." He grabbed his coat from the peg. He was halfway to the door when he stopped and turned back. He looked at her. Really looked. The kind of looking that takes a second and costs something. "Why are you doing this?" he said. The question sat in the air between them. She thought about several answers, practical ones, sensible ones, the kind of answer that kept feeling at arm's length, where it was manageable. Then she thought about Victor Hale signing a forged document with a smile. She thought about the laughter on the platform. She thought about the particular satisfaction of a man who uses other people as instruments and never considers the instruments have minds of their own. "Because someone decided I wasn't worth taking seriously," she said, "and I'm tired of proving people right about that by walking away." Rowan held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded once, pulled his hat down, and went out into the cold. She sat back down at the table, pulled a clean sheet of paper toward her, dipped the pen, and started writing. She worked for 6 hours straight. The copies she made were meticulous. Every discrepancy documented, every calculation shown in full, every entry cross-referenced to the page and line where it appeared in the original ledger. She organized it the way she imagined a lawyer would need to use it. Not as a story, but as evidence. Each piece numbered, each number explained, nothing assumed, nothing left for interpretation. She had seen enough of the world to know that justice, when it came to people who had organized their paperwork. Around midday, she stopped to eat, leftover beans, still good, with a piece of the ham, and realized while she was eating that she hadn't thought once about Philadelphia, hadn't thought about the cold water room she'd been renting above the hat manufacturer's supply warehouse, hadn't thought about the 3 women who'd been kind to her and the many more who hadn't thought about the specific loneliness of a city full of people where you know exactly which spaces you're not welcome in and navigate accordingly, every day, for years, until the navigation becomes so automatic you forget you're doing it. She hadn't thought about any of that because she'd been too busy thinking about this. The fire needed more wood. She got up, got the wood from the pile by the door, added 2 pieces to the stove. She washed her bowl in the water basin. She went back to the desk and kept writing. Rowan got back as the sun was dropping, which in late November meant around 4 in the afternoon. He came in stamping snow off his boots and pulling off his gloves with his teeth, and something in the set of his shoulders told her before he spoke that it had not gone straightforwardly. "Pratt says he can get a message to a lawyer named Calloway in the capital," he said. "Takes 2 weeks minimum for the weather. Could be more. That's within our window. There's something else." He hung his coat. He didn't come to the table right away. He went to the stove and put his hands near the warmth of it, which she was learning meant he was thinking about how to say something. "Hale was in town today," he said. "Came out of the bank when I was crossing the street. Saw me. He didn't say anything, just looked." He paused. "But that look." She waited. "He knows we're not dead yet," Rowan said, "and that bothers him." She set down the pen. She had been doing accounts long enough to know that there are 2 ways a scheme falls apart. Slowly, through exposure and legal process, or quickly, when the schemer panics and does something reckless. A slow unraveling could be managed. A panicked man with resources was a different problem. "He's going to do something," she said. It wasn't a question. "He's going to do something," Rowan agreed. Outside, the sun finished setting. The darkness came in fast the way it did out here, total and immediate. None of the gradual city dusk she was used to. The lantern on the table made a small, warm circle. Beyond it, everything was just the sounds of a ranch at night. The cattle shifting in the barn, the horses, the particular creak of the house settling into the cold. She handed him the document she'd spent 6 hours writing. He took it, read the first page, then the second, read slowly, the way he did most things. Not because he was slow, but because he was thorough. She watched him reach the page with the fabricated fees and saw the muscle in his jaw go. $197, he said. Invented. If we can get this in front of Judge Calloway before April 1st, it's not just the money. He set the document down. It's that someone sat in this house, at my table, and did this. While I was feeding him supper and thinking he was doing his job. I wasn't angry exactly. He was something quieter than angry. I trusted the process. I made my payments. I kept my records. He looked at her. I did everything right. Yes, she said. And none of it mattered. It matters now. She tapped the document. Because you kept those records, we can prove it. If you'd had nothing, we'd have nothing. He was quiet. People like Hale, she said, count on the people they steal from not having evidence. They count on the fact that a rancher 400 acres out of town running his operation alone isn't going to have someone sitting down and actually reading his own books. She looked at him steadily. He didn't count on me. The corners of Rowan's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion that one might eventually be possible. No, he said. He didn't. She turned back to her notes. He picked up the harness from last night, still unfinished, and settled into his chair by the fire. They sat like that for an hour. Her writing, him working, the fire going, the night outside doing whatever the night in Dakota Territory chose to do. It was not comfortable exactly. Comfort was something that came later, after you'd earned it. But it was something. It was two people who had been put in an impossible situation by someone who underestimated both of them, sitting in a warm room, working toward a solution, and not speaking because there was nothing that needed to be said right now that wasn't already being said by the fact of being there. Somewhere between 9 o'clock and 10, Rowan said, without looking up from the harness. You cook like that every night? Or was the first night a performance? She didn't look up from her writing. I cook like that every night. Good, he said. She wrote another line. The beans could use more salt, he said. The beans, she said, were perfect. He didn't argue. She heard something that might have been the beginning of a laugh, cut short. She kept writing. In the morning, they would send the message to Pratt. In 2 weeks, maybe more, a lawyer named Calloway would receive a document so organized and so damning that it would be difficult to ignore. In the meantime, Rowan had a ranch to run and 63 head of cattle to keep alive through a Dakota winter, and Adeline had more of the ledger to go through because she was not yet entirely certain she had found everything. Victor Hale had set this in motion thinking it would end a man. He had not once considered what the woman might do with it. The message to George Pratt went out on a Tuesday, carried by a rancher named Allen Marsh, who was heading toward town anyway and owed Rowan a favor from 2 summers back involving a borrowed wagon and a broken axle. Rowan watched Marsh ride out from the porch and didn't say anything for a while. Adeline stood beside him, close enough to feel the cold coming off his coat, and she watched too, and neither of them talked about the fact that they had just committed to a course of action that, if Hale found out about it before Calloway received those documents, would put them in a considerably more dangerous position than they were already in. He's reliable? She asked. Marsh? Yes. Rowan turned back inside. He doesn't like Hale either. Lost 2 good pasture acres to a boundary dispute 3 years ago. Hale's surveyor conveniently made an error in Hale's favor. How many people around here has he done that to? Rowan pulled the door closed against the cold. Enough. She filed that away and went back to the ledger. She had been through it 4 times now, and each pass turned up something new. Not because she'd missed things initially, but because the more context she accumulated, the more certain entries revealed themselves as anomalous. A fee recorded in February when the roads out to the ranch would have been impassable. A note in Hutchins' handwriting referencing a meeting that Rowan had no memory of attending. Small things, individually ignorable. Together, they built a picture of a scheme that had been running for nearly 3 years, patient and methodical. The kind of fraud that worked precisely because it was never dramatic enough to trigger alarm. Victor Hale was not a stupid man. That was the part she kept returning to. He was strategic. He had identified what he wanted, identified the obstacle, and built a mechanism to remove the obstacle legally, or legally enough that by the time anyone noticed the construction was fraudulent, the outcome would already be final. The forged marriage letter had been almost an afterthought, a way to add financial and social pressure to a man already being squeezed from another direction. Two-pronged, economical, cruel in a way that never required him to get his own hands dirty. She respected the architecture of it, even as it made her stomach turn. She was thinking about this, about the specific intelligence required to build a scheme that patient, when Rowan came in from the afternoon feed looking different than he had going out. Not different in a visible way, not clutching anything or moving wrong, but his face had that locked quality again, that specific stillness, and he went to the window before he said anything, which she had learned meant the news wasn't good. Hale bought the Deering place, he said. She looked up from the desk. Where's that? North of me, about 1.5 miles. He had his arms crossed over his chest, looking out at the blue-gray afternoon. Deering had 400 acres and a good hay meadow. Sold last week, apparently. I heard it from Marsh before he left. He paused. Hale now has land on my north side and my east side. She understood what that meant without him explaining it. He's surrounding you. Once he gets the south pasture through the bank claim, I'm landlocked on 3 sides. The only way my cattle reach anything resembling open range is through his land. He turned from the window. He doesn't even need to do anything after that. Just sit and wait. She set down the pen. He won't wait. That's not what this is. Rowan looked at her. A man who builds something this carefully, this patiently. He doesn't do it because he wants a standoff. He does it because he wants a finish. She turned a page in the ledger without looking at it. The land purchase, the bank fraud, the letter. These aren't separate moves. They're a sequence. He's running a clock. April 1st. Maybe sooner. She pulled the clean copy of her document toward her and looked at the dates again. Rowan, when does the bank board meet? Do you know? He thought. First Monday of every other month. So, he calculated, first Monday of December. 11 days away. If Hale has someone on the board, she said, and she said it carefully because she was still working it out while she spoke, he could move to accelerate the claim. Call the loan in default early, before January, before we have time to get Calloway here. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Can he do that legally? If the loan documents have an acceleration clause, yes, it's not uncommon. She looked at him steadily. Do you have a copy of the original loan agreement? He went to the back room. She heard him going through things. Not a methodical search, but the search of a man who has never thought of paperwork as something requiring organization, which was information in itself. After about 10 minutes, he came back with a thin sheaf of papers held together with a piece of string. She found the acceleration clause on page 3. It's there, she said. He sat down heavily in the chair across from her. In the event of missed payment or financial irregularity, she read aloud, the lender reserves the right to accelerate the repayment schedule upon 14 days written notice. She set the paper down. 14 days notice, which means if they decide to move at the December board meeting, you'd have until just before Christmas. Rowan put both hands over his face, pressed them there for a moment, and took them away. Calloway can't get here by Christmas. No. The word sat there between them, blunt and unhelpful. She didn't offer false optimism. She'd learned a long time ago that false optimism was its own kind of cruelty. It delayed the grief without preventing it. What was needed right now was not reassurance. It was information. Specifically, information about what options remained inside a closing window. We need to find the money, she said. The actual cash. Where did the 12 payments go after Hutchins intercepted them? I paid those payments directly to the bank. In person, in town. Every time? He paused. No. The last 3? Spring, summer, fall of this year. I was short on hands and the weather was bad 2 of those 3 times. I sent Denny Webb. He's a hand of mine who winters in Granton. Webb took the money to the bank. Said he did. And you got a receipt each time? Rowan's expression told her the answer before he said it. Webb brought back a receipt, same kind I got when I paid in person. Bank stamp, clerk's signature. Hutchins' signature. I didn't look at whose signature. I looked at the bank stamp and filed it. He exhaled slowly. I trusted it. Do you still have those receipts? He went back to the papers. Came back with 3 of them. She looked at all 3. They had the Granton Territorial Bank stamp, slightly uneven on all 3, which could mean the stamp was worn or could mean someone was pressing it without proper backing. The signature on each was Hutchins. The dates aligned perfectly with Rowan's ledger entries. Receipts printed on bank paper, bank stamp, clerk's signature. She turned them over. On the back of the second one, barely visible, there was a faint impression, the ghost of handwriting that had been on a piece of paper pressed against this one at some point. She tilted it toward the lantern. Numbers. And the beginning of a name. Just the first 3 letters. H-A-L. She said nothing about it immediately. She set all 3 receipts on the stack with the rest of the documentation, face down, and made a careful note in her own writing on the sheet beside them. She would come back to that. Webb, she said. Where is he now? Winters in Granton. Should be there until March. Could you get him out here? Rowan studied her face. He had gotten better at reading her in the past week. Or perhaps she had gotten less careful about concealing her thinking, because this place was starting to feel like somewhere she didn't need to hide in. What did you find? Maybe nothing. Probably something. She looked at him. I need to talk to Webb. The next morning, Rowan rode to Granton. He was gone most of the day. Adeline worked, kept the fire, fed the cattle at midday, using the procedure Rowan had shown her. Not gracefully, not without difficulty, because 63 head of cattle in a confined winter pen were not interested in accommodating a woman from Philadelphia who was still learning which animals were aggressive and which were merely large, but she did it, and nothing went wrong, and she was unreasonably satisfied with that. She was back at the desk, warming her hands around a coffee cup, when she heard hooves outside. 2 horses. Rowan and someone else. Denny Webb was not what she'd expected. She had imagined a drifting type, interchangeable with a dozen other winter ranch hands. What walked through the door was a young man, maybe 24, with a patchy attempt at a beard and the particular anxious energy of someone who has known something was wrong for a long time and has been waiting for someone to ask him about it. He took off his hat inside the door and held it in both hands. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Webb." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down." He sat. Rowan stood by the door with his arms crossed. She put the 3 receipts on the table in front of Webb, face up. "You delivered money to the bank on 3 occasions this year. Is that right?" "Yes, ma'am." "And each time the clerk, Mr. Hutchins, gave you these receipts?" Webb looked at the papers and something crossed his face, a tightening. "Yes, ma'am." "Did you watch him write them out?" A pause. "2 of the 3 times, yes." "And the third?" Webb put his hat on his knee and pressed it flat with one hand. "Third time. That was August. Hutchins said the receipt book was in the back office. He took the money and went to get it, came back with the receipt." He paused again. "He was back there maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Long enough to put cash in a drawer, write a receipt from a pad he had back there, come back out with an official-looking piece of paper." "Did anyone else come to the counter while he was gone?" she asked. "One man. Didn't come to the counter, just came out of the back office, heading for the door. I didn't know who he was then." Webb's hand pressed harder on the hat. "But I've seen him in town since. Rides a black horse. Everybody knows him. That's Mr. Hale." The room was very quiet. Rowan didn't move from the door. Adeline set her pen down with deliberate care. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I'd like you to write down exactly what you just told me. Today's date, your name, what you saw. I'll write it out myself and you can sign it if you'd prefer." "What's this for?" "It's for a lawyer in the territorial capital named Calloway." She looked at him steadily. "It's for a courtroom." Webb looked from her to Rowan and back. He pressed his hat against his knee 3 more times. Then he said, "Hutchins always made me nervous. Something off about a man who smiles that much when he's taking your money." "Will you sign a statement?" Webb looked at Rowan. "He's going to know it was me." "He's probably going to know anyway," Rowan said from the door. It was not particularly comforting, and it wasn't meant to be. It was just true. Webb sat with that. Then he put his hat on his head, took it off again, and said, "Get me a pen." She wrote the statement out in her clearest hand. Webb read it twice, which told her he was more careful than he looked, signed it at the bottom in a surprisingly neat signature, and Rowan co-signed as witness. She added the statement to the document stack, noted the addition in her summary index, and looked at what they now had. It was, she thought, enough. Not overwhelming. Nothing about this was overwhelming, but enough. The altered ledger, the fabricated fees, the miscalculated interest, the 3 intercepted receipts with the ghost impression on the back, the witness placing Hale at the bank on the date of the final payment. A lawyer with any competence at all could build a case from this. Whether they could get it to the right lawyer before the December board meeting was a different question. She was thinking about that, still at the desk, when Webb had gone and Rowan had come back in from putting the horses up. He came in and stood in the middle of the room, and she could see, now that the practical matter of retrieving Webb was concluded, that the day had cost him something. Not energy. He wasn't a man who ran low on energy. Something else. The specific weight of a man who has been discovering, in increments, the full extent of what was done to him. "He's been in my house," Rowan said. "Hutchins." "I know." "He sat at this table." "I know." She turned in the chair to look at him. Rowan, we have Webb's statement. We have the receipts. We have everything I pulled from the ledger. We need to get this to Pratt tomorrow, not in 2 weeks tomorrow, and we need him to find a way to get it to Calloway faster than the normal route. The roads. I don't care about the roads. She said it without raising her voice, which made it more emphatic somehow than shouting would have. Hale is going to move at the December board meeting. We have 11 days. If Calloway gets this before then, we have a legal basis to block the acceleration. If he gets it after... She didn't finish. Rowan looked at her, then he said, Pratt has a younger brother in Fillmore. Fillmore is 3 days from the capital, maybe 2 in good conditions. If he can get the documents to his brother, who carries them from Fillmore? Someone with a fast horse and a reason to move, he thought. Calloway owes Pratt's brother a debt. From years back, something legal. Pratt mentioned it once. Get to Pratt first thing tomorrow. She was already reaching for a fresh envelope, calculating. I'll have everything ready tonight, clean copies, indexed, the summary letter on top written plain enough that a judge can read it without a lawyer explaining it. He nodded, but he didn't leave the room. She looked up at him. You didn't have to do any of this, he said. She thought about telling him that she'd had nowhere else to go, which was true, but not the whole truth. She thought about telling him it was the logical course of action given the circumstances, which was also true, and also not the whole truth. She thought about the specific look on Victor Hale's face when he'd seen Rowan in town, that satisfied proprietary look she'd heard described and could now picture clearly, and she thought about what she'd felt when she'd turned over that receipt and seen the faint impression of 3 letters. I'm doing it because it's right, she said, and because I'm good at it. She paused. And because I am very tired of men like Victor Hale deciding how other people's stories end. Rowan was quiet for a moment. You have that in common with me, he said. She turned back to the desk. Then go get some sleep so you can ride at first light. He went to bed. She wrote until the lantern oil ran low, switching to the second lantern, and finished the summary letter just past midnight. She read it through once. It was good. Not dramatic. She had resisted every impulse toward rhetoric, keeping it clean and factual. Each claim followed immediately by its evidence reference. A document built not to persuade, but to prove. She folded everything into the envelope, sealed it, wrote Calloway's name on the front in her best hand, and set it on the table where Rowan would find it in the morning. Then she went to bed and slept hard and dreamlessly, which was the best kind of sleep. She didn't hear the writer. That was the thing she thought about afterward, in the days that followed. How the attack, when it came, was almost silent at its beginning. Just a sound she incorporated into sleep and then didn't, a horse moving in the wrong way. Not the sound of one of their horses in the pen, but something more purposeful and more exterior, and she was awake before she understood why. She lay still for a moment. Outside something moved. Not wind, not cattle, something that had direction. She got out of bed with her blanket still around her shoulders, more by instinct than by plan, and moved to the window. She couldn't see much. The moon was behind cloud cover, the yard was dark, the barn was a dark mass. But there was a shape near the east fence that hadn't been there before. Then another one. She went to Rowan's door and knocked twice, hard. Rowan. She kept her voice low and even. There are men outside. She heard him come awake fast, not gradually, not with the confusion of deep sleep interrupted, but the immediate sharp waking of someone who has spent years listening for things in the night. His boots hit the floor. She heard him moving. He came out with his coat half on and his rifle in his hand. She had already pulled her own coat over her nightgown and had her feet in her boots without the laces done, which was an inelegant arrangement she didn't have time to fix. East fence, she said. At least 2 of them. He was at the window. A silence. 3, he said. Then outside, something happened that was fast and loud and immediately understood. A shot, not directed at the house, but into the air, and the herd in the pen exploded into noise and movement, that specific panicked sound of cattle at the edge of stampede, and she understood what it was. They were trying to run the herd. Rowan was at the door. She put her hand on his arm without thinking. Don't go out there alone, she said. If they break the fence, I know, but don't go out there alone. She looked at him with the directness she'd been practicing all her life, the look that said she was not asking a favor, but stating a fact. What do you need me to do? He looked at her for 1 second. There's a pistol in the top drawer of the desk. You know how to use one? My father was a printing man, not a soldier, but I'm a fast learner. It's already loaded. You point, you cock the hammer back, you squeeze, don't pull. Squeeze. He was at the door. Stay in the house unless I go down. You understand? If I go down, you go out the back window and you run for the marsh place northeast, 2 miles. You don't stop. She said nothing. Adeline. I heard you, she said. He went out. She got the pistol from the desk. It was heavier than she expected. She stood at the window where she could see the most of the yard, the pistol in her right hand, and she watched. What happened next was loud and fragmented and did not resemble anything organized. 2 of the riders had gotten in behind the cattle pen and were driving the herd toward the north fence, which was the weakest section. She knew that because she'd heard Rowan mention it needed repair. The 3rd rider was moving along the barn wall, and in the moonlight that broke through the clouds for a moment, she could see something in his hand that was not a gun. Rope. He was carrying rope and something else, something dark and shapeless. She understood it at the same time Rowan did, because she heard him shout, a single sharp wordless sound. And then she heard him running, not toward the cattle pen, but toward the barn. The man at the barn had a torch. She was out the door before she had consciously decided to move. She registered that she'd decided not to stay in the house. She registered it the way you register a fact about someone else's decision, with mild interest, while your body was already doing what it had decided to do. She cleared the porch steps in 2 moves and was in the yard, and the cold hit her full in the face, and the ground was icy and uneven under her unlaced boots, and she was running. The man at the barn turned when he heard her. Not Rowan, who had gone around the other side, but her, this large, dark shape coming across the yard at him in the near darkness, and she saw him hesitate the way people hesitate when something doesn't fit the scenario they prepared for. He had the torch. The rope was looped over his shoulder. He had a gun on his hip, but it wasn't out, which meant he hadn't expected resistance from this direction, which meant he had 1 second of surprise and she was going to use it. She hit him with her shoulder at full speed. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing that looks any particular way. She was a large woman moving with all the momentum she had across a frozen yard, and she hit him at the shoulder and upper chest, and they both went down, hard, into the ice and mud of the yard. And the torch went skittering and she landed on top of him, and he made a sound like a man who has had the air knocked out of him, which he had. She didn't stop to assess. She grabbed the torch with one hand, which was burning and which she registered as burning and which she held anyway. And she pushed up off him with her other hand, and she threw the torch as far away from the barn as she could manage, which was not far, but far enough that it landed in a patch of muddy snow near the water trough, and went out with a hiss. The man under her was recovering. She raised the pistol. "Don't," she said. She wasn't sure what her voice sounded like in that moment. She hoped it sounded like a person who had made a decision and was not going to change it. She thought it probably did because he stopped moving. "Face down," she said. "Hands where I can see them." He turned over slowly. He was young. She could see that in the broken moonlight, younger than she'd expected. 20 maybe. The hired hand kind of young that does what it's told for wages. Not a true villain, just a person who had made bad choices about who to work for, and was now lying face down in frozen mud while a woman from Philadelphia stood over him with a pistol. She heard Rowan's voice from the barn side, sharp, directing, followed by the sound of the 2 other riders retreating, the cattle still heaving and bellowing in the pen. A minute. 2. Then boots crunching on frozen ground coming toward her. Rowan stopped when he saw what he saw. She was standing over the downed man with the pistol steady in her right hand, her coat open over her nightgown, her boots unlaced, her hair down, her palm burned from the torch. She could feel the burn now. She hadn't felt it before. "He was going to fire the barn," she said. Rowan came closer. He looked at the man on the ground. He looked at Adeline. He looked at her hand. "You're burned," he said. Ed. "I know." "Are you—" "I'm fine." She lowered the pistol. "The other 2? Ran. He crouched over the man on the ground, grabbed his arm, and pulled him upright. The young man's face was muddy and white and scared. Rowan looked at him for a long moment with that particular expression that she had learned was the one he used when he was restraining a large number of feelings. "Who sent you?" The young man's jaw worked. He said nothing. "You don't have to protect him," Adeline said from above. "He'll leave you to take the law alone. That's how men like him operate. She said it without cruelty, just matter-of-factly, the way you tell someone the weather. You're the only one of the three who got caught. Think about what that means for how he'll treat you. The young man looked at her, then he said very quietly, Breck. A man named Breck. He pays for the work. Breck works for Hale, Rowan said. I don't know who Breck works for. Rowan stood up. He was holding the young man by the collar, and he looked at Adeline over the man's head. She could see something in his face that hadn't been there before tonight. Something past the careful containing he usually did, past the controlled reaction, something rawer than that. He was frightened, not of the men, of something else, of how close this had come to something he couldn't account for in his planning. She knew what it was because she felt it too, a little, that particular vertigo of a situation that moved faster than thought. He's going to escalate, she said quietly. Yes. This was a warning, or it was meant to be one. She looked at the young man who was staring at the ground. Except it didn't work. No, Rowan said. It didn't. He tied the young man to the fence post near the barn with his own rope, not rough about it, but not gentle either, and went to check on the herd. Adeline went inside, ran cold water from the barrel over her burned palm, and wrapped it in a strip of cloth she tore from the bottom of her spare underskirt. The burn was not severe. The torch had only been in her hand for a moment. It would blister. It would hurt. It was manageable. She went back to the desk. The envelope addressed to Calloway was still on the table where she'd left it. She picked it up and held it for a moment. Then she put it back down, sat, and added a page to the document stack inside. A brief, precise account of what had occurred tonight, dated, timed as accurately as she could estimate. The description of the attempted arson, the attacker's statement naming Breck, the connection to Hale. She sealed the envelope again. Rowan came back inside an hour later. The herd had settled. The fence had held, barely. He stood in the middle of the room, looking at the envelope. You added to it, he said. Attempted arson and intimidation of a witness are additional crimes, she said. Calloway should know about them. Rowan looked at her hand, the wrapping, the burn underneath it. He stood there for a moment and she saw him work through something. Not the words for it exactly. She didn't think he had words for whatever this was. This particular kind of feeling that arises when someone risks themselves for something that is yours. And he ended up saying none of it. What he said instead was, First light. I ride to Pratt myself. Yes, she said. You'll be alone here. I've been alone before. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he went to the stove and put water on for coffee, because it was well past 3 in the morning and neither of them was going back to sleep. And they sat together in the firelight with the burnt smell of an almost catastrophe still faint in the air. And they drank coffee, and they didn't say much. And that was enough for now. Outside, the young man tied to the fence post was going to have a very cold and reflective few hours until morning. Victor Hale, somewhere in his comfortable house on the far side of Granton, did not know yet that his warning had failed. He did not know that the woman he had sent as a weapon had just knocked his man flat in a frozen yard and held a pistol steady over him until the threat was done. He still thought he was winning. He was running out of time to be right about that. Rowan rode out before dawn with the envelope inside his coat, pressed flat against his chest where the cold couldn't get at the paper, and neither could anyone watching the road. Adeline stood on the porch and watched him go and did not wave, worry than the one they were living. She watched until the darkness swallowed him, then she went inside and built up the fire and started the morning the way she started every morning now. With coffee, with the ledger open on the table, with her notes arranged in the order she'd need them. Her hand hurt. The burn had blistered overnight the way she'd known it would, and the cloth wrapping pulled against it when she moved her fingers. But the pain was the manageable kind, the kind that stays in the background while you work instead of sitting in the foreground demanding attention. She had known worse. The young man from last night was gone by morning. Rowan had cut him loose before he rode out, with a specific warning delivered quietly that she hadn't heard the exact words of, but could read in the young man's face when he walked past the window heading toward the road. Whatever Rowan had said, it had been enough. The young man had walked fast and hadn't looked back. She spent the first hour of the morning doing what she'd been doing in the back of her mind since the night before, thinking through what came next if Pratt got the documents to his brother, if his brother got them to Calloway, if Calloway was the right kind of lawyer in the right kind of mood, if the territorial court would hear it before the December bank board meeting. It was a chain with a lot of links, and chains failed at their weakest link, not their strongest, and she was not in a position to know which link was weakest. What she knew was this: the documents were solid. She had built them to be solid. She had triple-checked every reference, every figure, every cross-notation. If they reached a competent judge, they would hold. If. She was still sitting with that word when she heard a horse outside, and her hand moved to the desk drawer before she registered the movement. It was Olin Marsh. He was at the door in his heavy coat with his hat in his hand, and the look on his face told her something had happened before he opened his mouth. "Miss Pierce," he said. "Is Rowan here?" "He rode to Pratt's this morning." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came in and didn't sit, stood near the door with his hat turning in his hands. "I heard about last night. Sound carries in this weather. My oldest boy thought he heard shots around midnight, wanted to go over, but I told him to wait until morning." "We're all right," she said. "What happened?" Marsh pressed his hat flat. "Bank posted a notice this morning, on the board outside the general store." He reached into his coat and came out with a piece of paper, folded once. "Somebody pulled it down before most people saw it, but I got there early." She took the paper and read it. It was a formal acceleration notice. Granton Territorial Bank versus Rowan E. Mercer. Outstanding loan balance of $340, plus accrued fees totaling $109, for a total claim of $449. The South Pasture, 40 acres with water rights, held as collateral. Payment demanded in full by December 15, 1883, or collateral to be seized and transferred to clear the debt. December 15th, not April 1st, not the board meeting on the first Monday of December, December 15th, which was 9 days away. She read the total again, $449. They had added $109 in fees she had never seen in the ledger, invented in the last week. After Rowan had gone to see Marsh, after Marsh had sent the message to Pratt, they knew. Not the full extent of what she'd found. If they knew that, they would have moved faster and harder. But they knew something had shifted. Hale had decided not to wait for the board meeting. He had filed for acceleration through some mechanism she'd need to examine, pushed the deadline to the earliest legally defensible date, and added phantom fees to ensure the total was unreachable. $449 in 9 days. She put the paper down on the table. "Miss Pierce," Marsh said, "you all right?" "Yes." She was already at the desk pulling out the copies she had made of the document index. "Mr. Marsh, I need you to do something, and I need you to do it today." "Name it." She looked up at him. Marsh was a solid man. Not clever in any visible way, but the kind of reliable that came from spending 40 years doing what he said he was going to do. She had assessed that about him the first time Rowan mentioned his name, and she had filed it away. "I need you to ride toward Pratt's place and intercept Rowan on his way back. Tell him what you've told me. Tell him the deadline is December 15th, and the total is $449. And if Rowan's already left Pratt's, then ride faster." She held his gaze. "He needs to know before he gets back here, so he has time to think on the road." Marsh put his hat back on. "What are you going to do?" She looked at the acceleration notice on the table. "I'm going to find the $109. He left. She sat back down. The $109 was the tell. It was too specific to be arbitrary, not a round number, not a percentage of the claim total. $109 meant it was built from specific line items, fabricated line items, but specific ones, which meant Hutchins had generated a written record of them somewhere, and that written record would have been generated in a hurry in the last few days, and hurried work left traces. She didn't have access to the bank's records. She couldn't walk into the Granton Territorial Bank and demand to see what Hutchins had put together. But she had something almost as useful. She had 3 years of the bank's communications with Rowan, every letter, every notice, every receipt, and she understood now how Hutchins built his fabrications. She had read enough of his work to know his patterns. She pulled everything out and started going through it again, this time not looking for what was wrong in the ledger, but looking for what was consistent across all of Hutchins' documentation. The specific language he used, the categories of fees he invented, the way he formatted charges. If she could establish his pattern with evidence she already had, she could demonstrate that any new fees were built in the same fraudulent pattern. It took 4 hours. Her hand throbbed the whole time. She stopped once to change the wrapping and once to eat something standing at the stove because sitting back down felt like too many steps. By early afternoon, she had it. Hutchins had a limited vocabulary of invented charges. He used 3 categories repeatedly: assessment fees, administrative processing fees, and what he called rural delivery surcharges, which was creative because there was no such thing as a rural delivery surcharge in any legitimate territorial banking standard she was aware of. All 3 of his existing fabricated fees in the ledger fell into those categories. The new $109 she would bet her remaining good dresses was built from the same 3 categories. She wrote it out as a separate addendum to the main document, clear, sourced, showing the pattern across all 3 years of fabricated fees, demonstrating that any new fees claimed would follow the same demonstrably fraudulent structure. She had just set the pen down when she heard 2 horses outside. Rowan came through the door with Marsh a step behind him, and she knew from Rowan's face that Marsh had reached him on the road and told him. Rowan had that look he got when something had accelerated past his planning. Not panicked, never panicked, but a particular forward-leaning tension in his jaw and his shoulders that she had learned to read as controlled alarm. December 15th, he said, 9 days. She turned the acceleration notice toward him on the table. He moved it up because he knows something is happening. He doesn't know what, but he knows. Rowan read the notice. Marsh stood by the door, not intruding. 449, Rowan said. I don't have half that. The 109 is fabricated, same pattern as everything else Hutchins built. She showed him the addendum. But proving that in court takes time we don't have. She paused. Calloway needs to file for a stay. Something that stops the foreclosure clock while the fraud case is heard. That's our only move now. Not fighting the amount, blocking the process. Can he do that from the Capitol? If he files with the territorial court immediately, yes. A preliminary injunction. He doesn't need to be here. He needs to file a motion asserting that the underlying debt is disputed and that evidence of fraud has been submitted for review. She looked at Rowan steadily. Did Pratt send the documents? Sent his brother south with them this morning, before I arrived. A pause. Which means Calloway should have them in 2, maybe 3 days. Then we have maybe 5 days after that for him to act. She did the arithmetic in her head. It's tight. It's tighter than tight, Marsh said from the door, and she had almost forgotten he was there. Hale won't stop at the bank notice. He's going to put pressure on everyone in the county who does business with Rowan. I've already heard it. 3 men this morning telling me they'd been approached, told that associating with Mercer was bad business going forward. Rowan turned. Who? Taggart at the feed store, brothers over at the mill, and your neighbor Cade, East Pasture. Cade. Something moved in Rowan's expression. He owes me a winter's worth of hay storage. Hale told him the debt would be forgiven if Cade refused you access come spring. Marsh turned his hat over in his hands. He'd been doing that since he arrived, she noticed. Always that hat, always that turning movement, the physical expression of a man carrying something uncomfortable. I'm not in his pocket. I want you to know that. I'm here, aren't I? You're here, Rowan said. He said it simply, and it meant more than the words. Marsh nodded, put his hat on, and left them to it. The next 3 days were the worst kind, Chet. The kind where you have done everything you can do and you are waiting on other people to do their part. And waiting is always harder than working. Rowan kept the ranch running. He fixed the north fence section the riders had weakened, drove fence posts into frozen ground with a methodical fury that she understood was the physical outlet for everything he couldn't resolve by action. She cooked, kept the books, made 2 additional copies of the full document in case something happened to the first, and tried not to count the days too visibly. On the 3rd night, she was sitting by the fire when Rowan said, without preamble, Tell me about your father. She looked up. He was at his chair with a piece of harness he hadn't actually been working on for the last 20 minutes, just holding it. Why? She said. Because I've been sitting here for 3 nights with a woman I know almost nothing about, and we might lose this ranch in 6 days, and I don't want to just sit here doing nothing. She thought about the version of that answer that was brief and deflecting, and then she thought about how much she had come to dislike that version of herself. The one that kept things at arm's length as a matter of habit rather than genuine choice. He was a good man, she said, not a practical one. He believed that if you did honest work and treated people right, the rest would sort itself out. She paused. The rest did not always sort itself out. The fire. The fire was August. But before the fire, there were 10 years of the rest not sorting itself out, and him explaining to me why it was about to, and me keeping the books, and watching the gap between what he hoped and what was true. She looked at the fire. I loved him. He drove me half mad. Both of those things were completely true the whole time. Rowan was quiet for a moment. My uncle was like that, he said. Good man, terrible rancher, borrowed against the land twice before he died and never told me about the second time until he was on his deathbed. A pause. I was 23 and I didn't know what a promissory note was. Had to figure it out while I was also trying to figure out how to keep 60 head of cattle alive through my first Dakota winter. How did you? Badly, he said. Lost 20 head that first winter. Made every mistake available. He set down the harness. But I kept going. She looked at him. This man who had spent 15 years turning a debt-laden ranch into something that worked, alone, through seasons that she was only beginning to understand the weight of, and who had responded to a shipwrecked woman appearing at his train station with a level of basic decency that she was still, quietly, a little startled by. Why didn't you send me back? She asked. That first day. You could have. He thought about that with the seriousness she had come to expect from him. Because the storm was coming, he said. I wasn't going to leave anyone out in that. That was the reason? That was the first reason. He looked at the fire. By the time the storm was over, I had other ones. She held that. It was not a declaration of anything she could precisely name. It was Rowan, which meant it was honest and specific and offered without performance. And she found, sitting there in the firelight with her burned hand in her lap and the ledger on the desk and 9 days counting down, that it meant more to her than a speech would have. Go to sleep, she said. You too, he said. Neither of them moved for another hour. The rider came on the 5th day. Not Pratt's brother, a different man entirely, a lean man on a gray horse who came to the door in the early afternoon and introduced himself as Tom Airy, clerk to Calloway, out of the territorial capital. He had ridden straight through, he said, since he received the package 2 days ago, stopping only to rest the horse. He had the look of a man who had slept in the saddle more than once on the trip, and he accepted the coffee she put in front of him with the reverence of someone for whom coffee has become almost spiritual. Mr. Calloway reviewed the documents the same night he received them, Airy said, both hands around the cup. He wants me to say directly, these are the most organized fraud documents he has seen submitted to this office. His words. Adeline said nothing. Rowan, across the table, said nothing either. He filed for a preliminary injunction with the territorial court yesterday morning. Motion to stay foreclosure proceedings against Whisper Creek Ranch pending review of evidence of systematic bank fraud. Airy reached into the bag at his feet and produced a document with a court seal. The stay was granted yesterday afternoon. The room was very quiet. Rowan picked up the document, read it, set it back down. Hale can't move on December 15th, Adeline said, making sure she understood. He cannot legally transfer or seize the collateral property until the fraud case is heard. Judge Dennett has scheduled a hearing for the 22nd. Airy looked at her. Mr. Calloway will be here. He wants to meet you. Me specifically? He wants to meet the person who built the document. Airy picked up his coffee. He said, and I'm quoting exactly, that whoever organized this evidence understood how judges think. He paused. He assumed it was a lawyer. Rowan looked at her across the table. She felt the look but didn't return it. It's Adeline Pierce, she said to Airy, not a lawyer. Airy absorbed that without visible reaction, which told her Calloway had prepared him for it. He'll be here the 20th, he said. Wants 2 days to review with you before the hearing. She nodded. He'll have everything he needs. Airy left to rest at the Marsh place for the night, declining their offer of the back room on the grounds that he'd imposed on enough ranchers today, and one more would strain his conscience. After he was gone, the house was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. A quieter quiet, the particular silence of a pressure releasing. Rowan sat at the table with the court document in front of him. She sat at the desk. December 22nd, he said. Yes. In Granton. Yes. He turned the document over and set it face down, which was a thing she had noticed he did with papers that carried weight. Turned them over so the words stopped demanding attention. Hale is going to know by tomorrow, he said, when his bank gets served with the stay. Yes. He's going to do something. He's going to try to discredit the documents, say the ledger was altered by me, that I fabricated the discrepancies. She had been thinking about this since the moment Ari rode away. He'll go after me specifically because I'm the easiest target. I'm a woman who arrived here under suspicious circumstances, sent by an enemy, no standing in the community, no history here. Rowan turned in his chair to look at her directly. You have standing. I have standing with you. The community is a different matter. She said it plainly, not bitterly. He'll call me a fraud and a schemer and worse. He'll say you're a man so desperate you let a woman invented by his enemy manipulate your records. She met his gaze. We should expect that. It's the logical move. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then how do we counter it? By making sure every piece of evidence is independently verifiable. Webb's statement, the ghost impression on the receipt, the 3-year pattern in Hutchins' fabrications. Every single piece should hold up without my word at all. She turned back to her notes. And by making sure I am the one who presents it in that courtroom, in front of every person in Granton who laughed at me on that platform. He was still looking at her. She could feel it. Adeline, he said. She kept her eyes on the desk. Look at me. She looked at him. He was sitting forward, elbows on his knees, and his face had the expression she had come to understand was as close to unguarded as he got. Not soft exactly, but without the containing, without the careful management. If this goes wrong, if the hearing goes against us, I want you to know that none of this was your fault. What happened to you coming here? What Hale did? I know it wasn't my fault. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. He paused. And I want you to know that regardless of what happens with the ranch, he stopped, started again. You're not a joke. You were never a joke. Whatever those people thought when you walked off that train. He said it without decoration, without flourish, the way he said everything that mattered. You're the most capable person I've had in this house, including me. She sat with that for a moment. She thought about this platform, the laughter, the woman on the train south who had looked at her with that particular mixture of pity and satisfaction. She thought about all the rooms in her life she had walked into and immediately understood she was the wrong shape for them, and had navigated anyway, and had done what was needed anyway, and had handed someone else the credit anyway. She thought about this kitchen, this desk, this ledger. Then let's not lose the ranch, she said. Something moved in his face that she was choosing not to name yet. He picked up the court document and turned it face up again. I'll ride to Marsh tomorrow. Tell him the hearing date. He'll spread the word to the other ranchers. The other ranchers who Hale approached. The ones who refused him. There are more of those than Hale thinks. He looked at her. People like Hale always underestimate how much other people dislike them. They mistake fear for loyalty. She hadn't thought about it in exactly those terms, but she recognized the truth of it. They might come to the hearing. They might, he said, if they know what's at stake. What is at stake, she said, is whether one man can build a wall around 400 acres of someone else's land by lying on paper and buying compliance, and whether the people who know about it will show up in a room and say so out loud. She paused. That's a story people understand. The night of December 20th, Calloway arrived. He was not what she'd built in her imagination. She had pictured a lean, precise man, the kind who speaks in complete sentences and wears his authority like a fitted coat. What walked through the door was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s with a badly trimmed beard and a coat that had clearly been slept in at least twice on the journey, who shook her hand with both of his and said, Miss Pierce, Tom told me you made the best cup of coffee in 3 counties. Please tell me that's true. It was, she thought, the right way to begin. They worked through that night and the next day, she and Calloway at the table with the documents laid out in full, Rowan present and answering questions when asked. The whole constructed architecture of what Hutchins and Hale had built spread open like a machine with its casing removed. Calloway asked good questions, sharp ones, the kind that came from someone who had built and demolished a lot of arguments and knew where they failed. Twice he stopped and wrote something in his own notes. Once he leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a long time and said nothing. And she let him think. And eventually he looked back at the documents and said, The ghost impression on the receipt, you're certain about that? I'm certain I saw it. Whether it survives the courtroom depends on whether we can get the paper examined by someone credible. She paused. I don't know who in Granton qualifies. I brought a man with me, Calloway said. Document examiner out of Bismarck. He'll look at it tonight. She had not expected that. You were confident enough to bring an examiner before you'd seen the evidence? Calloway looked at her. I was confident enough in the organization of the documents to trust there was something worth examining. He picked up his coffee cup. In 30 years, I have received maybe a dozen document packages I didn't have to fix before I could use them. Yours was one? She looked at the tabletop. Thank you. Don't thank me. Win the hearing. The document examiner, a quiet man named Ferris, who communicated primarily through a series of specific sounds rather than complete sentences, spent 2 hours with the receipt under a magnifying glass, and came out of the back room with a single sheet of paper on which he had written out what he'd found. The impression on the back of the receipt, he wrote, showed the numeral patterns consistent with a bank account ledger entry and the partial letters HAL, consistent with the first portion of the name Hale. He could not certify the full name with certainty. He could certify the impression was made by a document that had rested against this receipt at the time of writing. Hale's account ledger, pressed against a receipt made out in Rowan's name, in the back office of Granton Territorial Bank, on the day Denny Webb dropped off a payment that never reached the bank's official records. Calloway read Ferris's notes and said, "That's enough." The morning of the 22nd was clear and very cold, the kind of cold that makes sound carry far and gives everything a brittle, overexposed quality. Adeline dressed carefully, her good wool dress, the deep blue one she had kept clean through everything, the one she'd worn almost nowhere because there had been nowhere to wear it. She pinned her hair up properly, which took longer than usual because her burned hand still didn't move quite right with fine work. Rowan was in the main room when she came out, in his good coat. She hadn't seen it before, slightly too formal for daily use, the kind of coat kept for occasions that required looking like you took the occasion seriously. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything about how they looked, which was the right call. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They went out into the cold and got into the wagon, and she carried the documents on her lap in the envelope she had prepared, and they drove to Granton. The courthouse was a single large room in a building that also served as the territorial administrative office, and it was full when they arrived. Not half full. Full. People standing along the walls when the seats were taken, ranchers she recognized from Rowan's descriptions, faces she didn't know, and a considerable number of people from town who had come for reasons she suspected had as much to do with curiosity as justice. The platform crowd. Some of them. Here again. She did not look for their faces. She looked at the front of the room. Victor Hale was already there, seated at the table to the left with two men she didn't recognize, lawyers from somewhere with money behind them. She could tell by the suits. Hale looked exactly as she had pictured him from everything she'd assembled over the past weeks. Well-built, well-dressed, the kind of face that spent a lot of time expressing confidence as a default. He looked across the room when she and Rowan entered, found her, and held the look for a moment. She looked back at him without expression. He looked away first. She sat beside Calloway at the right-hand table. She set the documents in front of her in the order she would need them. She folded her burned hand in her good hand on top of the stack, and she waited for the judge to sit down. When he did, and when the room quieted, Calloway leaned close and said, very quietly, "When it's your turn, just say what you found, exactly like you wrote it. Don't explain more than asked. Don't defend yourself before you're attacked." "I know," she said. "You've done this before?" "No," she said. "But I've been underestimated in rooms my whole life. I know how to wait." Calloway studied her face for a moment. Then he nodded once and straightened up. Judge Dennett called the room to order. Hale's lawyers went first as the filing party. They presented the acceleration notice, the loan documents, the claimed fees, the whole legal architecture of the foreclosure case, efficiently, confidently, with the practiced smoothness of men who had done this in front of territorial courts many times and knew which parts judges paid attention to. It took 20 minutes. When they finished, the case looked solid, clean, the kind of legal action that ends predictably. Then Calloway stood up. He took 12 minutes to establish what the documents were, where they came from, who had organized them, and in what capacity. He didn't introduce Adeline as a bookkeeper, or a mail-order bride, or any other category. He introduced her as the person who had discovered and documented systematic fraud against his client, and he said it with the flat certainty of a man who intended to prove it in the next hour. "Miss Pierce," he said, "will now present the evidence as she organized it." She stood up. The room was quiet in a particular way. The quiet of a lot of people paying attention to something they hadn't expected to pay attention to. She felt it, the weight of it, all those eyes. The platform crowd, the ranchers along the wall, Hale at his table, still and watchful. She picked up the first document. She did not look at the audience, she looked at the judge. In March of 1882, she said, a loan of $340 was recorded in the ledger of Whisper Creek Ranch, in a handwriting inconsistent with the ranch owners. I have identified that handwriting as belonging to Dale Hutchins, clerk at Granton Territorial Bank, through comparison with signed documents in Mr. Hutchins's own name. She set the first page in front of the judge. Over the following 18 months, 12 quarterly payments were made by Rowan Mercer toward this loan, recorded in his ledger as received. The bank claims none of these payments arrived. She set the second page down. I will show you where they went. She had practiced this, not in words exactly, but in sequence. She had run the order through her mind dozens of times until the structure was automatic, until she could move from point to point without searching for the thread. The fabricated fees, the interest miscalculation, Webb's statement, the receipts, Ferris's examination, the 3-year pattern in Hutchins' language. Each piece laid in front of the judge in the exact order it needed to be received to build a complete picture. She did not rush. She did not stumble. When Hale's lawyers objected twice, she waited while Calloway addressed it and then continued from exactly where she had stopped. 40 minutes. She was on her feet for 40 minutes, and when she sat down, the room was a different kind of quiet. The kind that comes after something has shifted, and everyone in the room knows it has shifted, but nobody has said so yet. The judge looked at the documents for a long time. He asked 3 questions, all directed at Adeline, all technical, all answerable directly from the records she had in front of her. Hale's lawyers asked for a recess. The judge gave them 10 minutes. In those 10 minutes, Adeline sat at the table and did not look at the room and did not speak, and Rowan sat beside her and put his hand briefly over her unburned hand on the table, just for a moment. Then he took it away. That was all. When the recess ended, Hale's lawyers attempted to do exactly what she had predicted, challenged her standing, questioned her motives, suggested the ledger had been altered after the fact, called her an agent of misdirection deployed by an enemy of their client. They were not wrong that it was the logical move. They were wrong that it would work, because every claim she had made was independently verifiable, and she had made it that way deliberately. And Calloway had the document examiner's certification and Webb's signed statement and the bank's own correspondence to Rowan, and none of it required her personal credibility to stand. The courthouse erupted when Judge Dennett announced his findings. She didn't hear the exact words at first because the sound of the room swallowed them. She heard Hale's voice somewhere to her left, a single sharp syllable, cut off. She heard Calloway say something next to her. She heard Rowan, who was not a man given to visible reactions, exhale in a specific way she had never heard from him before. The claims of fraud were substantiated. The foreclosure was voided. The case was referred to the Territorial Marshal for criminal investigation of Dale Hutchins and Victor Hale. She sat still while the room moved around her. Someone touched her arm. She looked up. It was one of the ranchers from the wall, a weathered man she didn't know, maybe 60, with the calloused hands of someone who had worked land his whole life. He didn't say anything. He just nodded at her once, with the specific gravity of a man who means what he does with his face. Then he went back to the crowd. She turned to pick up her documents, stacking them carefully back in order, returning them to the envelope, doing the thing she always did when she didn't know what to do with her hands. Rowan was watching her. "You can leave those," he said. "I know," she said. She kept stacking them. "I just need a minute." He waited. He was good at that, she had learned, at waiting without it feeling like pressure. When she finished, she put the envelope in her lap and looked at the front of the room, where Judge Dennett was writing something, and at the left table where Hale's lawyers were leaning together in urgent conference, and at the door through which she could see, just barely, that 2 men she didn't recognize had positioned themselves in a way that suggested they were the Territorial Marshal's men, waiting. Victor Hale was still at his table. He had not moved. She could see his profile. Still that composed, confident face, but something different in it now, something she recognized. The expression of a man who had built a very careful machine and watched it come apart and has not yet absorbed the full weight of what that means. She had seen that expression on her father's face in the shop, reading the final notice from the bank before the fire made it irrelevant. She had seen it on her own face once, in a mirror in Philadelphia, the morning she decided to answer a letter that turned out to be forged. She did not feel satisfaction looking at it now. She felt something more complicated than that, something closer to tired and close to done, and underneath that very quiet, beginning to stir, something that felt tentatively like possibility. Calloway was gathering his own papers beside her. "Miss Pierce," he said without looking up, "have you ever considered reading law?" "I'm a woman," she said. "I know that," he said. "I asked if you'd considered it." She looked at the front of the room, at the judge, at the marshal's men moving toward Hale now, finally, their purpose becoming clear to everyone in the room. "I'll think about it," she said. They walked out of the courthouse into the cold December air, and neither of them said anything for a while. The street was not empty. People had followed them out, not in a mob way, not with any particular organized intent, but the way people follow when something significant has just happened, and they're not ready for it to be over yet. Adeline was aware of them peripherally, the way she had learned to be aware of crowds since that first day on the platform, that specific tracking of bodies and attention that had become automatic. But the feeling was different now. Not the bracing she used to do. Something else. Allen Marsh caught up to them at the wagon. He had his hat off despite the cold, holding it against his chest, and he shook Rowan's hand and then, unexpectedly, turned to Adeline and did the same. His grip was rough, and his eyes were direct, and he said, "Miss Pierce, you did something today that this county has needed for a long time." She thanked him, and he went back to the crowd, and she climbed up onto the wagon bench, and Rowan came around and sat beside her, and they drove out of Granton the same way they had driven in 6 weeks ago. In the same wagon, on the same road, with the same landscape going flat in every direction under the same low winter sky. Except that nothing was the same, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so yet. It took about a mile before Rowan spoke. Calloway said the criminal referral will take 2 to 3 months to process. Marshal's office will investigate, build the case formally. Hutchins will cooperate, she said. He'll trade information on Hale for a reduced charge. That's what men like Hutchins do when the structure protecting them collapses. They become very talkative very quickly. "You sound certain." "I'm not certain. I'm experienced." She looked at the road ahead. "My father dealt with 2 men like that over the years. Suppliers who shorted him on materials, blamed bookkeeping errors. When it became clear the errors were too consistent to be accidents and they had a choice between defending themselves or talking, they talked." Rowan nodded slowly. "So Hale goes down on Hutchins' testimony." "Hale goes down on 3 years of paper trail and 1 frightened clerk, yes." She paused. "Though his lawyers will work to reduce the charges. He has money. Money buys legal complexity. He won't walk away untouched, but he may walk away from the worst of it with enough resources to rebuild somewhere else." She said it without particular bitterness, just as the plain shape of how things worked. "The important thing is he can't do what he was doing here anymore. The records are public now. The pattern is established. Every transaction he's made in this territory for the past 3 years is going to be reviewed." Rowan drove in silence for a moment. Then, the Deering place. She had been thinking about that too. Hale's purchase of the ranch to Rowan's north, the land he'd bought to complete the encirclement. That transaction was now under scrutiny as part of the broader investigation. Calloway had mentioned it briefly in the courthouse, flagging it for the marshal. Whether it could be undone depended on whether the purchase itself had involved fraud, which was possible given Hale's methodology, or whether it was simply an aggressive but legitimate land acquisition. "Calloway will look at it," she said. "Even if the sale holds, Hale can't use the land to threaten you anymore. Not with a criminal investigation attached to his name," she thought. "And even if he tried to find a buyer, nobody in this territory is going to purchase property associated with a fraud case until the investigation closes. The land is tied up for months at minimum. Months is enough." Rowan's voice had a quality she'd noticed creeping in since they left the courthouse, a kind of tentative steadiness, the sound of a man recalibrating to a situation where the immediate catastrophe was over, but the habit of crisis hadn't left yet. She recognized it. She felt it herself. "I can run the herd through spring without worrying about water rights. If I get the hay situation sorted with Cade will honor the arrangement," she said. Hale is in no position to forgive anyone's debts right now. Cade knows that. She paused. I'd go see him in the next week if I were you. Not to press him, just to give him a way back, and that doesn't require him to admit he was about to betray you. Rowan glanced at her sideways. That's generous. It's practical. You need neighbors more than you need apologies. She looked at the road. Apologies are nice. Reliable neighbors keep your cattle from drifting. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. The ranch came into view as the light was starting to drop. That blue-gold light of winter late afternoon that turned even the most functional landscape into something that looked briefly like it had been arranged intentionally. She had stopped noticing it the way she'd noticed it in the first days, the way you stop noticing things that become ordinary, and then all of a sudden she noticed it again. The way the light caught the snow on the north pasture, the barn roof, the smoke coming straight up from the chimney she'd banked before they left. Rowan pulled the wagon to a stop by the barn, and they both sat there for a moment without getting down, which had become a habit on this road, this stopping before things continued. I need to ask you something, he said. She waited. He was looking straight ahead, which she'd learned was where he looked when he was about to say something that mattered. You came here because someone forged a letter, he said. You stayed because there was nowhere else to go and a storm was coming. You did what you did because... He stopped. I don't actually know why you did what you did. I told you, she said, because it was right, because I was good at it, because I was tired of... I know what you told me. He turned to look at her then, which cost him something. She could see that. The small cost of a man who doesn't do this easily making himself do it anyway. I'm asking why you're still here, after the hearing, after all of it. He paused. Nobody's stopping you from leaving, Adeline. There's a train. You have money now. I owe you for what you did, real money, and I intend to pay it. You could go back east, go anywhere. She looked at him for a long moment. The honest answer was complicated, so she gave him the pieces of it in the order she understood them. I don't have anywhere to go back to, she said. That's the practical piece. Philadelphia is a city that's already made up its mind about what I'm worth, and I spent 31 years living inside that opinion, and I'm not interested in going back to it. She stopped. But that's not the whole reason. What's the rest? She looked at the barn, at the patched roof of the house, at the smoke still coming up straight from the chimney. I've been useful here, she said. Not in the way that people allow women to be useful. Quietly, in the background, doing things that get attributed to someone else. Useful in a way that had my name on it. In that courtroom today with those documents in my hands, that was mine. She felt something tighten in her chest as she said it. Not pain, but emphasis, something underlining itself. I've never had that before. Not like that. He said nothing. She kept going. And I've been... She stopped, restarted. I've been comfortable here. That's a strange word for a place that has tried to kill me with cold approximately 4 times, and where I burned my hand and lost sleep for 6 weeks and spent every day reading fraudulent documents. She looked at him. But I've been comfortable in the way that matters. Where I don't spend energy managing what people think of me, where I can just work and be. And that's enough. He looked at her for a while without speaking. Outside, one of the horses in the barn shifted and knocked against the stall wall. I want you to stay, he said. Not as a declaration exactly, as a plain statement, the way he stated everything that was true. Not because of the books, or the cooking, or because I need help with the ranch. He paused. Because I don't want you to go. Because... He stopped, put his hands on his knees. I'm not good at this. I know, she said. I haven't been... Another stop. There was a woman, years back. I mentioned her. Things didn't... Rowan. She said his name quietly, and he stopped talking. I know you're not good at this. I'm not particularly good at it either. We can both be bad at it together and figure it out from there. He looked at her. She held his gaze and did not look away, which was itself a kind of statement. All right, he said. She climbed down from the wagon. The cattle need checking. You do that. I'll start supper. Adeline, she looked back at him. The beans were perfect, he said. They always were. I was wrong about the salt. She turned away so he wouldn't see whatever her face was doing. I know, she said, and went inside. The investigation moved at the pace of territorial bureaucracy, which was not fast but was, to Adeline's professional satisfaction, thorough. The marshal's office sent 2 men to Granton in January. Dale Hutchins lasted exactly 4 days before he retained the cheapest available lawyer and began providing a detailed account of his arrangement with Victor Hale. 3 years of intercepted payments, fabricated fees, altered records, and a monthly arrangement that had been paying Hutchins $40 on top of his bank salary, which was almost exactly what she had suspected when she looked at the lifestyle discrepancy between a territorial bank clerk's wage and the new coat and boots Hutchins had been wearing every time Rowan described seeing him. Hale's lawyers were expensive and determined, and they managed to negotiate the criminal charges down from the most severe version to something that still carried consequences: fraud, conspiracy, misuse of financial position. He was removed from all territorial business dealings pending resolution, his assets were frozen for the duration of the investigation, and the Deering property purchase was found to have involved coercive tactics against the previous owner and was subsequently voided, the land reverting to the Deering estate. Victor Hale would not go to prison for as long as he deserved. Adeline had known that from the beginning, had said it to Rowan plainly on the drive back from the courthouse, and she had been right. He served 14 months in a territorial facility, returned to somewhere east of Minnesota, and was not heard from in the Dakota Territory again. It was imperfect. Most justice was. Hutchins served 3 years and left Granton for somewhere nobody knew or cared. The bank was placed under new oversight. The false debt against Rowan's South Pasture was formally discharged, the record corrected. The water rights fully and permanently confirmed in Whisper Creek Ranch's name. She kept track of all of it in a separate ledger. She started in January, not because anyone asked her to, but because she found that knowing where everything stood at all times was the way she managed the particular anxiety of a situation in resolution. The closed ledger was on the shelf in the back room, next to her books from Philadelphia, by the time the last formal document arrived in March confirming the discharge. She showed it to Rowan that evening. He read the document, set it on the table, sat with it for a moment. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she confirmed. He looked at the closed ledger on the shelf. "What's that?" "The investigation record. Everything from December through today. Who said what to whom, every legal document, dates, outcomes." She paused. "Calloway asked me to keep it. Said it might be useful for future cases involving similar patterns." Rowan looked at the shelf. "So you're corresponding with Calloway?" "We've exchanged 6 letters." She sat across from him. "He has a case in February. A different county, similar fraud structure. He wanted my analysis of the pattern." Rowan absorbed that. "And you gave it." "I did." She looked at him directly. "He offered to pay me for it. Consultant fees, he called them." She paused. "I took them." Something shifted in Rowan's expression that she watched with care, reading it as she had learned to read all his expressions. It moved through something that might have been surprise, and through something that might briefly have been an older, less examined reaction, a man recalibrating to a woman who had income of her own from work of her own, which was not the ordinary arrangement, and then it settled into something she thought was genuinely close to satisfaction. "Good," he said. That was it, just good. She could have loved him for that single word alone, she thought, and then noticed the thought without alarm, and set it aside to examine later at a time when she wasn't sitting across a table from him. Spring came the way it always came in Dakota. Not gently, not on schedule, but in fits, with cold days interrupting warm ones, with mud that made everything take twice as long as it should. The cattle came through the winter at 61 head, 2 lost to a cold snap in February that had been brutal even by Dakota standards. Rowan took those losses the way he took most things that went wrong, quietly, with a specific expression that lasted about a day, and then with his boots on going out to do what came next. By April, the ranch looked different than it had in November. Some of it was practical. The north fence was properly repaired. The barn door hung correctly on both hinges. The roof patch near the chimney had been redone right, with Marcia's oldest boy helping on a Saturday, the 3 of them working through a cold morning until the thing was sound. These were the visible accumulations of a winter spent with enough stability to do maintenance instead of only crisis management. Some of it was subtler. The kitchen had been reorganized in a way that made sense to Adeline and that Rowan had adapted to without comment, the way he adapted to most of her adjustments, with a practicality that she appreciated more than any formal acknowledgement would have been. There were curtains now on the 2 front windows. She had made them from fabric in her trunk that she'd brought from Philadelphia with no specific purpose in mind, and she had not mentioned making them or put them up with any announcement. And Rowan had come home one afternoon to find them there and had looked at them for a moment and then gone to hang his coat, and that was that. But what was different in the deepest sense was harder to see from the outside. In November, Whisper Creek Ranch had been a man alone managing a slow-motion loss, one fence and one fraudulent ledger entry at a time. The kind of loss that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but just gradually takes everything, and by the time you understand the full shape of what happened, it's already gone. Now it was two people who had chosen, deliberately and without false romance, to build something together. Not because the alternative was worse, though it was. Because they had looked at each other across a plank table in a cold room, in the middle of a conspiracy to destroy them both, and found something they hadn't expected to find. Not rescue, not salvation, not anything that required either of them to be less than they were. Just recognition. Two people who had been underestimated in different ways by different people, seeing clearly what the other one actually was. It was not without friction. He was stubborn in the way of men who have spent 15 years making every decision alone, and he sometimes forgot to consult her on things that affected the ranch's finances, which she had opinions about. She was exacting in a way that occasionally bordered on rigid, and there were days when her insistence on documentation and evidence and organized process was, she knew, exhausting for a man whose relationship with paperwork was at best tolerant. They argued twice about the spring planting arrangements, and once, memorably, about whether the south pasture could sustain additional cattle or whether pushing it would stress the water source during a dry summer. He thought yes. She thought probably not. She was right, which he acknowledged in the specific Rowan way of acknowledging things, by doing it her way without ever formally conceding the argument. He was also capable of surprising her, which she valued more than she'd expected to value it. One morning in March, she came into the kitchen to find he had rearranged the books on the shelf in the back room, not randomly, but by subject and size, in a way that actually made sense, and that she would have done herself eventually when she had time. She stood looking at it for a moment, and then went to start the coffee and said nothing, because some things didn't need to be said. Calloway came back through in April on his way north and sat at their table for an evening, reviewed two things she'd found in the pattern analysis she'd been building from his second case and the Granton case combined, and drank 3 cups of coffee and asked her again about reading law. "It's not practical," she said. "A lot of things that matter aren't practical." He looked at her over his cup. "You have the mind for it. You have the patience for it. And you see patterns that trained lawyers miss because trained lawyers are taught to look for what they expect." Rowan was at the fire, pretending not to listen, which he was doing imperfectly. "What would it require?" she asked. "Reading. A lot of it. I can send books." Calloway set down his cup. "There are women practicing law in this country, Miss Pierce. Not many, not welcomed everywhere. But they exist, and the territory is growing, needs competent legal minds." After Calloway left, she and Rowan sat in the main room in their usual places, her at the desk, him in the chair by the fire. And after a while he said, without looking up from the tool he was sharpening, "You should do it." "It would take years," she said. "So it takes years." He turned the sharpening stone in his hand. "You're 31. You have years." "I'm not sure it would mean for—" She gestured vaguely at the room, at the arrangement they had built. "For us." He looked up. "Yes." He set down the stone. "Adeline, you reorganized 3 years of fraudulent banking records in 6 weeks in a snowstorm, and then presented them in a territorial courthouse in front of everyone who laughed at you and made the fraud case airtight." He looked at her steadily. "Do you honestly think reading law is going to be the thing that breaks what we have here?" She looked at him. "When you say it that way." "Write Calloway," he said, and picked up the stone again. She wrote Calloway. The books arrived in May, 6 of them, with a letter that said to start with the second one because the first was mostly procedural history that she could absorb later when she had the framework to put it in. She read at night, at the desk, the same way she had read the ledger in November, carefully, annotating in her own notes, cross-referencing things that connected. It was slow work and uneven work, and there were chapters she read 3 times before they settled, and other sections that she understood immediately and completely, and the distinction told her things about her own mind that she found clarifying. Rowan would sometimes be awake when she finally set the books down, tending the fire or simply awake in the way of men who sleep lightly. And she would tell him what she'd been reading, not summarizing it exactly but thinking aloud, working something through. And he would listen, and occasionally he would ask a question that wasn't from legal knowledge but from common sense. From 15 years of watching how people actually behaved in disputes over land and money and obligation. His questions were often the best ones. She told him so once, and he said that wasn't possible, and she said it was, and they left it there. By June, Whisper Creek Ranch had 68 head of cattle. She had worked the numbers with Rowan in February, and they had added 7 head at the spring market, within the budget she'd calculated, and the pasture capacity she'd estimated. And the south pasture was holding at exactly the level of use she had predicted, the creek running clear and steady through it. Marsh stopped by one Saturday morning with his son, and they sat on the porch in the first real warmth of the season, and Marsh talked about the changes he'd seen in the county since December. 3 other small ranchers who had come forward with their own records of questionable bank dealings once the Hale case made clear that documentation could actually matter. The bank was under different management now. The new clerk was young and visibly anxious to demonstrate legitimate record-keeping, which Adeline found both reassuring and mildly amusing. "You changed things," Marsh told her. "Not with ceremony, just as a fact. People around here know it." "People around here needed the evidence more than they needed me," she said. "The evidence was always there, but it needed someone to read it." She didn't have an answer for that, so she let it stand. What she thought about later, that evening, walking the south fence line, while Rowan checked the north side, the early summer sky going pink above the flat horizon, was not whether she had changed anything or what credit she deserved for it. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a train in November into a town full of people laughing at her, with a carpetbag and a ledger and the plain conviction, built out of 31 years of being dismissed, that she was worth something they weren't seeing. She had not arrived knowing she would stay. She had not arrived knowing any of the things that followed. She had arrived because one door was open, and she had learned to walk through the open doors without waiting for better ones, because waiting was the thing that left you with nothing. What she had found through that door was not what anyone would have designed for her. Not romantic in any shape she had been taught to recognize as romance. Not easy in any way she could have called easy. A fraudulent crisis, a terrible winter, a burned hand, a courtroom full of people who had once laughed at her. A man who couldn't say what he felt until he absolutely had to, and then said it plainly and didn't elaborate. A desk in a back room with a lantern and a ledger and work that was genuinely, unmistakably hers. She stopped walking and stood at the south fence line and looked at the creek. The water moving over the stones it had always moved over, quiet and persistent, not particularly interested in being significant, just doing the thing it had always done. She thought about Calloway's question, about reading law, about the 6 books on the desk and the notes she'd filled in the margins and the particular way her mind worked when it encountered a system, the appetite for it, the patience, the specific pleasure of finding the flaw in a structure and understanding how it connected to everything else. She had done that her whole life and been paid for it in partial credit and grateful smiles and the occasional acknowledgement from men who then forgot her name. She did not intend to let that continue. The walk back to the house took 10 minutes. The light was still going when she reached the porch, that long, late summer evening light that she had come to love specifically because it lasted, because it gave you more time than you expected. Rowan was already back from the north pasture, sitting on the top porch step with his coat off and his sleeves rolled up, looking at the same sky she'd been looking at from the other side of the property. He moved over when she got to the steps. She sat beside him. They sat like that for a while, not talking, not needing to, 2 people who had learned over the course of one difficult winter exactly what the other one was made of and had decided, separately and then together, that what they were made of was enough. "The numbers are good," she said eventually. "The spring additions were the right call. If the summer stays moderate, we can look at 12 more head in the fall." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about the east pasture rotation. The fencing there needs doing first." "I was going to say that." "I know you were." She looked at the horizon. "I just said it first." He said nothing. She felt the warmth of him beside her in the cooling evening, solid and specific, the particular warmth of someone who is actually there. "Calloway's second case settled," she said. "He wrote this week. The pattern analysis I sent helped. He'll send more cases. He said he might have work enough by next year for a regular arrangement. She paused. I might need a different desk. He was quiet for a moment. There's a bigger one in the storage shed, he said. From my uncle. Too big for the back room, but if we move the room around, we can look at it tomorrow. Tomorrow, he agreed. They sat until the light was mostly gone, until the first stars showed up in the places they always showed up, reliable in the way that large things are reliable, not because they care, but because they are what they are, and they keep being it regardless. The cattle were quiet in the south pasture. The creek was doing its thing. The house behind them had warmth in it, and books on the shelf, and a desk that was too small but would do until they could get the other one. She was not the woman who had stepped off that train expecting a letter to be true. She was not the woman who had spent 31 years inside a city's idea of what she was worth. She was not the punchline of a cruel joke, not a weapon deployed by a man who thought only in terms of what other people could be used for, not an inconvenience, not a burden, not a footnote to someone else's story. She was the woman who had read the ledger. The rest, as it turned out, had followed naturally from that.